Hello, boys and girls, and welcome to another exciting episode of the best show of any genre ever in the history of the universe, Navonod on No Limit Hold'em. Today we're going to be talking about slow playing, when to do it, when not to do it, why we do it, why people do it wrong, and what the correct ways to do it are. I was inspired to create this episode by a session I played recently. Sunday, almost a week ago. I was at the called Horseshoe Casino in Cleveland with a guy that I used to coach. I don't coach him these days, but I did for a couple of years, kind of off and on. And he's more or less just a recreational player these days, not putting in a tremendous amount of value. No longer plays online, and well, he's just not quite serious about it. But I saw him make a play. I don't think I'm going to go into the details of the play, but we'll just say that he had a really good squeeze spot pre-flop, and he overcalled instead, and he checked the flop back multi-way with plenty of draws open, kind of a wet, volatile board, and called the turn and ended up betting the river when check two, got called and tabled pocket aces. And so this kind of got us talking about why it does or does not make sense to slow play in certain spots. And the part that struck me was how articulate his argument was, and how able he was to lay down kind of a almost defensible argument for why it would make sense to pass up on a prime squeeze spot with pocket aces, check back a wet flop, call the turn, and just bet the river. And that made me think I should maybe do a video about slow playing, because maybe people don't understand it. And if you have some version of fancy plays syndrome, and you just really like to make these types of plays, and you know a lot about poker vernacular and the lingo, you may be able to actually convince yourself and other people that this is the right thing to do, when in fact it may not be. The argument about squeeze or not squeezing with the aces was because he felt like he was going to be overcalling a lot in that spot, and he didn't want to cap his overcalling range. That's a reasonable sounding argument, but it obviously misses some things, and we're going to talk about that. So generally speaking, most of the time, the best rule of thumb is, when in doubt, play your big hands fast. Just tend to play your big hands fast. You're going to use your bluffs to balance by playing your bluffs aggressively, just like you're playing your nutted value hands aggressively. You don't want to play your nutted value hands passively to balance those against your weak hands. That's not how you want to work this out most of the time. And remember, more than anything, the object of the game is to maximize your value in every situation, or minimize your losses, and it's not to see how you can trick your opponent. Like, it's not deception. Like, if you use if somebody asks you, why did you do this, and your answer is for deception, that's a shallow answer. It doesn't say really anything. Now, that's not to say that it's necessarily incorrect, or that you couldn't, sort of expound upon that and make it make sense, but it doesn't do you any good to just deceive your opponent. You have to know why that deception is going to pay dividends. I mean, sometimes deceiving your opponent could backfire. Sometimes it could have no effect. Often it has no effect, or very, very often it has an effect maybe, but not strong enough of an effect for the price you pay by doing what's probably mathematically incorrect to cause the deception in the first place. So yeah, basically tend to not slow play unless the slow play is actually for one of a couple of legitimate reasons. Excuse me. So I have these reasons listed in an order that I think is probably not the right order. I think we'll talk about this order, or this reason first, because in a pure game theoretical sense, your slow plays are really just there to protect your showdown value bluff catcher type hands. Like, the reason that you're going to slow play in some spots is because you're going to want to check back in some spots with a lot of mediocre hands, or you're going to be in some situations where if you take action A, it's going to partition your range off dramatically from action B in a way that one of those two ranges is going to be really capped and kind of face up, and having just a couple of slow plays inside or within a range like that uncaps the range, and it can make a tremendous amount of difference. You really need a strong reason to try to make an exploitative slow play for reasons of deceiving your opponent into putting more value or more money in on future streets, especially when you're in position and checking back, and especially on volatile boards, and especially against multiple opponents. The reality, again, is your slow plays from a purely game theoretical perspective are there to protect your showdown value hands. So if you get into a situation where you're going to have a lot of hands that want to get the showdown as inexpensively as possible, that are like, I don't know, second pair, or maybe you're playing heads up and you've got ace king on 2-2-3 rainbow. You've just got like a showdown value hand, a bluff catcher that wants to check back and maybe call once or twice. Okay, if you're in a spot where you're going to have a lot of hands like that, it can be very valuable to work just a couple slow plays into your range, because what that's going to do, it's going to do a couple of things. It's going to stop your opponent from just like mindlessly blasting enormous overbets into the pot every time you take a check back, and it's going to make a lot of money from your opponent when you actually do have that hand. So it's kind of the same way that value hands will balance out against air or semi-bluffs. Like your bluffs protect your value hands. Well, you also can use your nutted value hands to protect your showdown value, or like the bluff catcher parts of your range. For example, sometimes your entire range seems to be just very mediocre. You might be in a spot where you're going to have a lot of pretty good hands, but you're not going to have very many, if any, nutted hands. And even though your opponent won't have as many good hands overall as you, he will have more copies of the nuts in his range. When you're in a spot like that, it can really pay off to take a pot control line. And if you're going to take a pot control line with like your overpairs or your top pair top kickers, then it makes a lot of sense to also play top set the same way. So here's an example. Middle position opens and you 3-bet from the button. Middle position calls your 3-bet. You go heads up to the flop, and it's queen jack 8 rainbow. So what does your range look like here? If you're like a lot of players, you're going to have a lot of hands like top pair top kicker and overpairs, but you're probably not going to have a tremendous amount of 2-pair. You're not going to have like the nuts. You're probably not 3-betting 10-9 suited from the button against the middle position open, I wouldn't think. You're not going to have pocket 8s. You might have jacks. You probably will have queens, and you likely can have jacks too. So you're going to have a couple of nutted value type hands, but not many. You're not going to have very many like really strong hands. Mostly, when you get to this spot, the hands that you have that have some value are going to be strong, but they're not going to be the kind of hands that want to get stacks in. And if you're playing against an opponent, especially an opponent who's capable of check raising their draws, in a spot where maybe it looks like to them that they're at a pretty clear range advantage, and queen jack 8 it's a flop texture that definitely favors pre-flop callers range in general. In this specific situation where we are in position and our opponent's out of position, and we just 3-bet from the button against the middle position open raise, maybe it's not the cleanest example of that. But nonetheless, you're in a spot where, as pre-flop raiser, you're probably going to want to take pot control lines with a lot of your range. And so if you were, maybe right now, before watching this video, if this flop comes out, you're going to tend to bet flop with pocket aces, check turn most of the time, and either call or bet the river, if that's kind of your standard line. But then with your sets of queens, you're going to try to bet flop, bet turn, and bet river. But then you're going to take like pocket tens and check those back, and you're going to take ace king and check it back. Well, it's not going to take a rocket scientist to figure out that whenever you check back, it's like free lunch. Like if you check back on this flop as pre-flop razor, and the turn breaks off, I can bomb the turn, and even if you couldn't, kind of hope you call me on the turn, because even if you do muster a call on the turn, you're going to have to fold your hand on the river. So if you're in a spot where you're going to want to have some hands that check back some of the time, then maybe if all else is pretty similar, you should just play your entire range the same way, or most of your range, the parts that you really care about, just check back, or maybe play your entire range that way. So like what happens if instead of betting flop with pocket queens, betting aces on the flop, checking them back on the turn, and checking ace king back, what if we just check our entire range back? So now when we have pocket aces and we check back, we can comfortably call just about any turn bet, and depending on the run out and the sizing, we can call down. So we'll have some hands that can check back and call down. We can definitely start value betting after our opponent checks again, and we can make some delayed C bets with bluff hands like ace king. Maybe we can chat, I guess it'd be dependent on whatever the turn card is, how we'd want to play tens, but just on the flop. And when we have kings, aces, or ace queen, we can check back for pot control on the flop. That way we're not turning our ace king face up when we check it back, or our pocket tens kind of face up when we check them back. And if we're going to do that, if that's kind of the strategy that we settle on, then we also want to check back our pocket queens. We don't want to only ever bet the flop when we've got a nutted value hand in a given spot. We're super exploitable, and against knowledgeable opponents, not only is that going to stop you from getting value with your big hands, but it's going to make life very difficult on you when you've got the capped part of your range that does check back. So again, in this situation, let's say we 3-bet pre-flop, get called by middle position, flop comes queen, jack, 8, rainbow, and our villain checks to us, and we have pocket queens. What if we just check back? Well, now if our opponent says, well, if he checks back, he's probably checking back to give up, or he's got some kind of a showdown value hand that I can take him off of, we're going to really give our opponent a lot of incentive to bluff into our set, and we can maybe like call a turn and get him to overbet the river, and we can raise, or maybe he overbet. Maybe he identifies in his mind that we've got like a bunch of showdown value bluff catcher type hands when we check back the flop. We're sitting there with pocket queens, and he goes like 1.5 or 2 times the pot on the turn, and then overbet jams the river. That's a pretty good time to have pocket queens, right? And the other end of the spectrum there is when we actually do have a hand like ace queen, and we check it back. It does us a lot of good to have pocket queens in our range. It's like the two help each other out, just like the relationship between value bets and bluffs, generally speaking. One adds value to the other. And that's the same way with slow plays, but just remember what the purpose of slow plays is. You're going to want to mix slow plays into your ranges when you're worried about capping parts of your ranges. Slow playing hands uncaps your range. So sometimes you're going to want to play one part of your range one way and another part of your range in another way. And if you do that, and especially if you've only got a limited number of combos of hands that want to take the second line, the secondary choice, then you can really turn your hand face up in a way. The example I like to give is just 3-betting pocket kings pre-flop and watching the flop come down ace XX. Then your opponent checks to you. What are you going to do with your pocket kings here? Well, what you'd probably like to do is check them back, right? If you bet, you're not going to get called by a worse. You're not going to get anything better to fold, and you're basically wasting your hand. You're just turning your hand into a bluff. But if you check it back when you would bet all of your sets, you would bet top pairs, and you would bet your air, well, then what the hell do you have? All you have left is like tens through kings. And you can't just show a decent opponent your hand and expect him to, not just destroy you or play perfectly against you and make your life really difficult. So if in this spot, ace 9-4, if you don't want to mess with balance and you don't want to think about slow playing anything, then you probably ought to just go ahead and bet your entire range, because far and away, if you're 3-betting pre-flop and the flop comes out ace, rag, rainbow, far and away the majority of your range wants to bet that flop either as a bluff or for value. So if you are going to bet almost all of your range and you don't want to mess with slow plays, if you don't want to mess with slow plays for balance, then you probably ought to just go ahead and bet your kings also. And I think that's fine. And because you're c-betting this so often, if that's your strategy, you probably can get called by second best. I don't think you're going to get through streets very often. Another strategy that you could use is you could just check back pocket tens through pocket kings and 10-9 suited type hands on this flop as pre-flop razor, or if you 3-bet pre-flop, flop comes down like this, you could check that stuff back kind of the way you'd probably want to, because you don't want to bet, if your opponent has an ace, you obviously don't want to bet pocket kings or pocket tens. And also, if he's got air, you'd probably just as well check your kings back and induce a bluff or get him to call down a little bit lighter on future streets. But again, it creates problems for your range, balance-related problems. So a way that you can go about solving the problem is just to work a small number of slow plays into your range here. If you c-bet all of your air and you c-bet all of your top pairs with decent kickers, and you just check back some mediocre showdown value bluff catcher type hands, maybe the ace-5 suiteds that you 3-bet pre-flop, if you check those back and your tens through kings, then just maybe all of your pocket aces check back as well. And I think that's gonna be plenty. Just being able to show up with the nuts in a spot like that is so powerful. And again, it's kind of the same thing we were talking about before. If most of the time when I'm checking back in this spot, it's because I don't have air, but I can't beat top pair bottom kicker, then it doesn't take a genius to figure out that I've got a hand between 9x and pocket kings, and therefore my opponent can play very, very well against that. And one of the ways he's going to play well against that range is by over-betting the turn once I check back his pre-flop razor, and then over-bet bombing the river. Or another way is to, whenever this flop comes down and pre-flop razor checks back, then the player that's trying to exploit his face-up range might check the turn, figuring that there's going to be a bet coming, and then choosing to check raise a wide and polarized range. So having aces in your range, even just occasionally, if you have the aces and your opponent decides to overbet the turn, and maybe he goes 2 times the pot on the turn, and then he ships 2 times the pot in on the river, and you stack him. You don't have to stack him all that often to make up for the times that you have a hand like pocket jacks and he blows you off of pocket jacks by overbetting the turn and then jamming the river. So it helps, and again, it's going to help your ranges in 2 ways. It's going to help you when you don't have pocket aces, but you have them in your range, and you actually have the pocket kings or the pocket jacks or the 10-9 type hand that it looks like you have. It helps you by way of threatening your opponent. It just doesn't allow him to take any 2 cards and rip it in against you, And the other way that it helps you is when you actually do have pocket aces in a spot like this, and you check back and your opponent figures that you usually have, and he correctly ascertains that you usually have some kind of showdown value type hand and he can take you off of it. then it obviously helps you a lot in that way also. And again, this is the same kind of balancing act that you see with value hands and bluffs. The inclusion of a certain part of your range can help your entire range, not just when you have that part of your range, but not only when you don't have that part of your range. It's sort of like if you were going to start mixing in some suited connectors into your under the gun open raising ranges in full ring games. You might decide to do that for board coverage. Like you might start opening 7-6 suited because your range is just so strong when you open under the gun that people stopped giving you action, except when the board comes like 7-7-6, in which case you're never even getting to showdown with your pocket aces. Well, having 7-6 suited in your range is going to help you in two ways. It's going to help you when you can make some value bets and actually get paid off, because they know that they have to pay you off some of the time, because some of the time you're bluffing on boards like ace king queen, right, or ace king 9, ace queen 7. But also it helps you when you have the 7-6 part of your range and the flop comes like 7-7-6 and your opponent knows that it's unlikely for you to have that hand. But then it also allows you, when the board comes out 7-7-6, it allows you to represent the 7-6 that at least does exist as part of your range. So there's a lot of ways that having hands that are maybe going to appear to be less likely, having those in your range can help you in just a wide variety of ways. But more than anything, what you're going to use your slow plays for is to protect your other checkbacks, so that you're not in a spot where every time you check back the flop, your range is capped. It just instantly uncaps your range. If you always check back pocket aces on ace 9-4, then when you check back your pocket kings, you're protected. So let's talk about the general factors that are going to make for a good slow play. We've talked about some stuff, but we haven't talked about this stuff yet. So it can make a lot of sense to take a slow play line when you've got the deck on complete lockdown, like you've got pocket aces on ace, ace 3. And the reason that you're slow playing in that spot is not so much to protect your showdown value. It's because your opponents are not going to value their hands correctly on a board like this, and they're just not going to call you down nearly as often as they ought to. So you've got to oftentimes incentivize them to give you action. Like your opponents just aren't going to have good second best hands very often when you've got ace ace and the flop is ace ace 3. They can't have an ace, and there's only one other card for them to have hit, and it's kind of unlikely since it's a 3, and they're not going to value their hands properly. They're probably not going to play king queen the way that they ought to. Like they're not going to give you action even when they should give you action. So you probably want to just go ahead and check in a spot like this. You're not worried about getting outdrawn or free rolling somebody to hit a gut shot or anything like that. I mean, you hope they hit a gut shot, right? You hope that you've got somebody there with 5-4 and they bink a 2. But you want to encourage them to bluff, give them a chance to kind of catch up, and you want to allow the board to develop in a way that gives you some value targets to value bet against, or incentivize your opponent to take a stab and create induce some bluffs. Another example is when villain is likely to pounce on any weakness. We've kind of talked about this, but basically the more likely that your opponent is to attack against perceived weakness, the more often you should feign weakness when you have a strong hand. Another factor is the volatility or static nature of a given board. The more static the board is, and by static I mean the more likely the player in the lead is on the flop to actually be in the lead at showdown, the more static the board is. So if you're in a situation where whoever has the best hand on the flop is pretty likely to have it on the river, that should incentivize you to be a little bit more prone or a little less reluctant to slow play. There's not going to be as much risk in giving free cards or free rolling your opponent's equity. There's not going to be as much advantage to folding your opponent's equity out. and there won't be as many value targets by way of not having the draws to value bet against. And lastly, the main thing. When you're in a spot where you have a lot of showdown value in your range, being able to rep showdown value hands with your slow plays and using your slow plays to protect your showdown value is exactly what you want to do with your slow plays. It's exactly why you ought to have slow plays in the first place, really. So in conclusion, the object of the game is not to trick your opponents, it's to make money. And you should tend to play your strong hands strongly. If you're worried about making your hands, but if you're worried that you're making your strong hands look too strong, and you're worried that you're not going to get action, the way to correct for that is not to start slow playing those hands. The way to correct for that is to start to bring in more bluffs into your range. If you're having a hard time getting called down with your big hands, you don't stop betting your big hands aggressively. You start betting your weak hands aggressively. Your opponent cannot both not call you down when you've got it and call you down when you don't have it. They can't give you all the action in the world when you're bluffing and yet get very nitty against you when you've got it, unless you are giving off some kind of crazy reads. So if that's been your experience, examine your poker face, man. Otherwise, really, if you're not getting action with your big hands, don't slow play them for that reason. Start to become more aggressive with your weak hands. Look for spots where much of your range is going to be mediocre strength, and simply don't partition your range when there's not a good reason to do it. Yeah, so like if there's not a good reason to split your range, and if splitting your range would make parts of your range to face up, then it can make a lot of sense to just take the same action with your entire range. And if you're in a spot like that and you've got top set or the nut straight, but you're checking your entire range back, don't be too afraid to just check your entire range back. You don't want to have like one hand in your range that does action A and 18 hands that take action B, or it's going to be pretty face up, very exploitable, and you're just not going to glean the benefits that we've been talking about, like having your opponent overbet bomb the turn into you when you actually have the part of your range that can do something about it. When parts of your range want to play passively, look to work in some slow plays. And tend to slow play less on volatile boards. And I'm not saying don't ever slow play on volatile boards. You have to consider your overall strategy, and you have to consider balance. You have to consider, you know, if I'm doing this with this part of my range, then can't my opponent exploit me? You know, always think in those terms. If you can get to a certain spot, and you're like, well, if I'm just always raising with my sets on this very wet board, and I'm only ever calling with draws, can't my opponent exploit me? Yeah, and so in a spot like that, you're going to need to either start raising your draws or start calling your sets. You can't just play one hand one way and one the other against, you know, anybody with half a brain. The other end of that is when you do these things that are unexpected, where there's just, you know, automatically inherent value in showing up with a hand that your opponent doesn't think you can have, right? So yeah, that's I think that covers pretty much everything I wanted to say about slow playing. Be careful with it. It's not the object of the game to trick your opponents. But don't be so worried about what people think about you and how clever you look. And don't use big words and cool terms like equity and range and capped or uncapped and bound, and don't use that kind of stuff to justify taking goofy lines for the sake of taking goofy lines. Hope that was insightful in some ways. Until next time, guys, thanks for watching. Although probably you should be thanking me, since this is the best video ever made on any subject ever in the history of the universe. And with that said, until next time, guys, good quote, Luck, end quote.
Daddy, you need some outro music.
What's outro music?
Some type of music that hooks people in. Like catchy music.
I don't know if my audience goes for outro.
Catchy music.
I don't know if my audience goes for outro.